emergent, you're watching for it. It can become immediate more quickly than you expect. It might take longer to emerge. And equally, something that is immediate could potentially recede back and flip into an emergent state and then come forward again. So sometimes I'm trying to think of a simple example. Like if you go back 30 years ago, e-commerce was immediate. There were real projects going on in the early 90s all over the world to do e-commerce, but it wasn't quite ready to go to scale. So it sort of drifts a bit back to being more emergent set of conditions and set of capabilities. And then suddenly the whole world is online doing transactions online, and e-commerce is an immediate condition again. So there are conditions that can sort of flex and flow. So you've got to have that view on a pretty continuous basis. Then we also think about scale. So a good conditions analysis takes into account some proportion of these scales as is required. So you might not need to go internal, local, state, national, and global. You might go internal because we're working in an organization. It's really important to understand the internal conditions. But given where we are, maybe local and state are going to be pretty similar. So we'll collapse that view. National might be important. It might not be global. You always want to have a global view because that's where you sometimes get your big shifts. That's where you see pandemic emerging from somewhere else in the world. But you can sort of determine scale as suits and it makes sense to understand what's going on. And then a conditions analysis is just a systematic collection of the data and then a way of interpreting that so that you've got real insight that informs your decision making, right? So what are the issues and factors that are already that will or may influence our performance or outcomes? So going back to that, disruption, it's any change in conditions which gets in the way of our ability to sustain value generation. So a conditions analysis is in a rigorous way, having an understanding of what that looks like and then keeping that up to date. Now, lots of people will say to me, oh yeah, we do a conditions analysis. And I'll say that's fantastic because one of the great things, if you really embrace conditions analysis, is sharing and getting a shared and broader view of what you're seeing. So I'll say that's fantastic. Would you mind sharing your conditions analysis with us? Because we'd love to see what you're watching, particularly in terms of what's emerging outside of your industry. And they'll go, oh, well, maybe we haven't really done that, right? So we think sometimes we're really seeing the world, but we're not. We're seeing what we've been trained to see. So it's about starting to really open up to that whole systems view. What I've found just in a very practical sense is when I first learned about conditions analysis, it was just sort of tuning into all the information that comes to us and just asking the question, what are the conditions behind that headline or behind that story or behind that bit of information? What actually sits behind that? What do I think is going on? How can I find out more about what's going on? And then it's staying in that state of mind. So we always talk about this particular strategy and action. So there's a focus, right? Which could be, we're doing our strategic plan for the next 3 years. Or it could be, I've got to get this project untracked. Or there's a new product line for my business. Or we're trying to get this to happen in our community. So what's the focus of this strategy and action? So you don't end up with a strategic radar that's too complex to understand, right? You want to be able to bound, in systems language, you want to bound the system that you're working in so that you understand enough, again, to get to good and quick decisions. You've got to think about what you don't know, right? I hate to quote Donald Rumsfeld, but it's probably the one sensible thing he said in his time as Secretary of Defense for the US. But there's a whole bunch here that we just don't know that we don't know because we're not tuned into it. That's where the network becomes really powerful. So cultivate a good, broad, and diverse network of information. Watch for the weak signals. Probably not the best analogy at the moment, but if the heat's being turned up, it might be an indication that there's a major disruption to come. And that's that, paying attention to those weak signals. When you start to get things like, an unknown virus, flu-like coming, that's weak signals, right? What does that mean? Oh, Oh, well, now it's looks like it's getting out of China. Australia is closing the borders to China. New Zealand's going to lockdown. The US is pretending like it doesn't exist. All those are weak signals that really quickly went from emergent to immediate. But if you were tuned in the way that I shared that example before, then you picked it up and you maybe did something a bit ahead of time. So again, I've said it a few times, but you source your information from as wide a field of vision as is required, right? So some of the sources are, if you're in an industry, you can do industry associations. There's a whole range of media, and you got to check your biases, know which bits of media are coming from which perspective. Customers are a great source of insight. You've got specialists and generalists. They're great people to have in the network. Suppliers in an industry context. If you're talking community or region, local business local industry become really great sources of insight in terms of what they're seeing. Colleagues, of course, there's organizations like the World Economic Forum actually now produce a pretty good strategic radar, so tapping into that sort of stuff and really just finding the sources of information that broadly start to create a shared view, and then sort of clustering that so that you're conscious about the radar that you're building. And we find that is the most important piece of doing conditions analysis, is just being conscious about the inputs, watching for it. And in an organizational context, depending on scale, potentially considering that becomes part of someone or a group of people's role. We find in medium to large organizations a really powerful way of hooking not the usual suspects into strategy and innovation and leadership is to consciously create them as part of a conditions team. Give them responsibility for paying attention to what's going on in the world based on their interest, based on their expertise, whatever it might be, and hook them into that conversation. It's a way of truly empowering people strategically, particularly if that information is codified in a useful way and then used in decision making. And thinking about, we sometimes talk about taking a diagonal slice of the organization so that you get people across a range of experiences and responsibilities, different time scales in terms of how long they've been with the organization, and so on, different leadership roles and so on. So you get a really good mix of people who, again, are not the usual suspects. And then the most important thing I've learned the hard way is never let the CEO loose on the conditions analysis to change it to fit their narrative. That's, once bitten, twice shy in that one. So does that make sense in terms of how you sort of start to gather and organize information? And then the last bit is, how do you document and visualize? So there are finally in the world starting to be some tools that allow this to happen a bit more dynamically, but we do find to a certain extent, and I'll share some templates post today with everyone, a spreadsheet where you actually think about, what is the condition that you're seeing? What's a basic description for it? In a community context, you might think, is it social, economic, environmental? You might use a pestle kind of tagging system if that's what you want to do. This bit here, we call it critical thinking for lack of a better heading, but is this an assumption? Is it an assertion? Do we have evidence? Do we have insight? Is it internal? Is it global? Is it a mix of the few? Is it immediate or emergent? What's the source of the information? Are there references that we can go back to? You can get over the top with this, but it's also really useful to have an up-to-date source that you can go back to. If you've got good business intelligence systems already in your organization or in your community, you use that. But that's a way of really starting to organize the information. And then how do you visualize it becomes quite important as well. We're going to work in a sec on some of the visualization. We find this it's an analog tool really, which is just using PowerPoint and putting conditions on what we call a conditions map. We actually find it's a really powerful way to visualize. What the human brain is able to do when you visualize conditions in this way is pick out the patterns, and it's a bit like seeing the constellations in the stars. So you start to be able to see, well, what are actually the things that matter most to us in this really complex view of conditions. The other thing that mapping conditions does is it reinforces for people the complexity of the environments that you're working in. And it's a visual cue to say, hey, look, we can't just run blindly forward assuming that this is simple. We've got to embrace that complexity. We find some organizations, they'll take these, they'll print them up, they'll do a complex conditions map where they've got different colors for different scales, and it just looks like chaos when you look at it with an untrained eye or not knowing those conditions. And you say, tell us what that's about. And they go, this means this, that means that, this is what we're watching here, here's how it relates to our strategy. And it's a narrative they carry through, and they've got an A0 map visually in different places in the building in the old days. They might have it in their home office on the wall today, whatever it might be. And the critical thing is you've got a centralized repository that someone's responsible for keeping up to date. And then again, once you've done your baseline maps, all that you report on is what's changing, right? If the things haven't changed, then there's no need to report. So you can move pretty quickly through that. So I'm going to jump us now into a little practice discussion. And the first question is just simply, what are you seeing as conditions, immediate and emergent, internal, right through to global, that are impacting your organization and or your community? And I just wanted to practice using the language of conditions. What I'll do is I'll note them down. I've got some maps that we've prepared earlier, an internal scale map, a state and national scale, and a global scale. And what we've put in here are just some conditions that we think are pretty common in terms of what's starting to emerge, but we're certainly not saying this is what you have to pay attention to. I'll add a bit of what we talk about today, but the sort of task, if you like, between today and when we reconvene in a few weeks' time is to do some conditions analysis work with your team, by yourself, with part of this network, and come back and at the start of the next session share what you're seeing in terms of a more resolved view in terms of conditions. And I'll provide you with templates to use. Again, we find it works. If you've got a better way of doing it, use what works for you. But we just might start there and just come back to this question. So immediate and emergent conditions, immediate conditions first. We'll practice emergent in a sec. We'll just take 5-6 minutes, just have a quick buzz through. What are you seeing in the world that we should be taking into account as immediate conditions?
And I'll encourage people to speak up, not use the chat box.
Changing requirements for products.
Tell us a bit more about that.
So where once I might do a face-to-face workshop with someone to develop their team, or an organisation to develop their team, now those sorts of things are more likely to be done remotely, and the way you need to think about how you develop, deliver, and actually promote those sort of things. And
Yep.
The environment is extremely noisy, so everyone's doing the same thing. So how do you differentiate yourself? This is the 99th one I could have attended today, I think. So, how do you actually differentiate yourself from that? Understanding what you've got that is a unique selling proposition in the current environment that is different to what it was before. It's changed all of a sudden, and so you have to rethink what you're selling or promoting and how you actually do that.
What I'm hearing there, just to check as conditions, one condition that came through quite clearly is it's difficult to differentiate in this environment. That there's a need to rethink in real time as another condition. That the changing nature of the unique selling proposition in this new environment, and then of course working in a digital reality as a couple of sort of key conditions. I
think for some people too, it's going to be upskilling, because suddenly the skills that I've got don't meet the current environment, and I'm almost some people have almost been made redundant because they haven't got those skills.
Yeah. As a brief side note, One thing